Welcome. It was a momentous week for the nation and the presidency. Just hours before Saturday's ninth Republican debate, conservative Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia died suddenly, unexpectedly. It felt like the balance of power in America had suddenly shifted. Many of the great issues facing the country are before the High Court right now: abortion, climate change, immigration, Obamacare, labor rights. But there would be no new tie-breaking liberal justice right away if instead of Barack Obama, a future Republican president could somehow make the appointment, there wouldn't be one at all. So a new question took center stage at Saturday night's debate. Should the Senate refuse to consider any nominee for nearly a year? A strategy that was the first reaction of the Senate Majority Leader.
It's up to Mitch McConnell and everybody else to stop it. It's called delay, delay, delay.
Donald Trump's rival, Ted Cruz, also embraced McConnell's just say no idea. So did Marco Rubio. Jeb Bush stopped just a little short of blanket opposition.
Of course, the president, by the way, has every right to nominate Supreme Court justices. I'm an Article 2 guy in the Constitution. We're running for the President of the United States. We want a strong executive for sure. But in return for that, there should be a consensus orientation on that nomination. And there's no doubt in my mind that Barack Obama will not have a consensus pick when he submits that person to the Senate.
John Kasich advised the president to refrain from nominating anyone at all because he said the country is already so divided. But Barack Obama will not comply.
Obviously, today is a time to remember Justice Scalia's legacy. I plan to fulfill my constitutional responsibilities to nominate a successor in due time. There will be plenty of time for me to do so and for the Senate to fulfill its responsibility to give that person a fair hearing and a timely vote.
And the president pointed out that there is no unwritten law that says when it's okay to fill a vacancy, and he added, this will be a test of whether rules, norms, and fair play can function in Washington. One gatekeeper who will be tested is the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Charles Grassley of Iowa. He said he was open to the possibility of a hearing on Obama's choice, but backs McConnell's position that the next president should make this lifetime appointment. And the Democratic candidate's reaction? Well, Bernie Sanders said that while he differed with Justice Scalia, he was brilliant and colorful. And now let's get on with it, he said, meaning fill the seat. Hillary Clinton took to the high ground behind the White House. She said blocking Obama's nominee would be outrageous and totally out of step with constitutional principles. Clinton has been attempting to bounce back from New Hampshire, and at a debate just 2 days after that crushing loss, Clinton may have already gained some ground, questioning Sanders' foreign affairs experience and accusing him of being vague about just who is advising him on international matters. But it's hard to put Bernie Sanders on defense.
Where the Secretary and I have a very profound difference. In the last debate, and I believe in her book, very good book, by the way, in her book and in this last debate, she talked about getting the approval or the support or the mentoring of Henry Kissinger. Now, I find it rather amazing because I happen to believe that Henry Kissinger was one of the most destructive secretaries of state in the modern history of this country.
And Bernie went on to blame Kissinger for setting in motion millions of deaths in the killing fields of Cambodia. Now, that may be ancient history to most voters in South Carolina, but the Iraq War is not, and that figures into the GOP race. Donald Trump has been accusing former President George W. Bush of telling lies that got us into Iraq, but the Bushes are popular in South Carolina. In fact, George W. has been stumping there for his brother Jeb, so Trump's accusation may have cost the Donald votes and perhaps helped his chief rival there, Ted Cruz, who has been hitting Trump hard with attack ads, including this one featuring children learning bad family values from Trump.
Look, I got the Trump action action figure.
No way, that's huge.
What does he do? He pretends to be a Republican.
I like bailouts for the banks. Too big to fail.
I gave money to Pelosi, Reid, and Anthony Weiner.
Hey, Hillary, I'll give you money to be my friend. Check out my house, Mr. Trump.
That's a lousy house. I'm gonna take your house with eminent domain and park my limos there. Eminent domain!
We wouldn't tolerate these values in our children. Why would we want them in a president?
Those kids sure know the issues. Maybe we should lower the voting age to 3. So with the ads running and the debates resonating and the Supreme Court tied at 4-4, who is gaining ground? Yes, time for the horse race. Voters go to the polls in 2 states this weekend, the GOP primary in South Carolina, the Democratic caucus in Nevada. Surprisingly, few voter polls have been conducted thus far in Nevada, just 7 in the last year, and only 1 since the New Hampshire primary. This compared to Iowa, where there were 9 polls in January alone. According to today's CNN ORC poll of likely Nevada voters, Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton are locked in a virtual dead heat, with Clinton at 48% of the vote and Sanders at 47%. The Microsoft research project PredictWise, which also factors in wagering activity, sees the close race favoring Hillary, putting her chances of winning the Nevada caucus outright at 55% and Bernie Sanders' chances at 45%. Nationally, little has changed for either candidate since New Hampshire. Clinton is currently predicted to have an 83% chance of winning the nomination based on who's betting, while Sanders hovers at 17%. At the same time, Democrats are duking it out in Nevada. Republicans will be battling for South Carolina supremacy. Real Clear Politics, RCP, polling averages, mostly of likely voters, show Trump with a commanding lead of 17 points and a polling average of 35%. But late momentum may be moving in Marco Rubio's direction. Polling by CBS showed that about a third of respondents declared Rubio to be the victor in Saturday night's GOP debate, and RCP polling averages for South Carolina show a slight uptick for Rubio in recent days. This is perhaps the result of a narrowing GOP field, but also an apparent shrugging off of his robotic debate misfire and poor performance in New Hampshire. Rubio is now a little behind Ted Cruz at 16%. John Kasich, who surprised many in the New Hampshire primary, appears to have leveled off from the slight bump he received and now sits just behind Jeb Bush at 9%. On Tuesday, it will be the Republicans' turn to caucus in Nevada. Today's limited CNN ORC poll of just 245 likely voters there shows Trump with a 26-point lead in Nevada, factoring in the betting markets once again. PredictWise calculates Trump's current chances of winning Nevada at 81%, while Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz trail considerably with 11 and 7% chances. All right, time to discuss the political and legal implications of Justice Scalia's unexpected passing. Joining us, distinguished lawyer and Barnard College professor Katherine Colbert. She argued a landmark Planned Parenthood case before the Supreme Court, with Scalia on the bench, a case that has been credited with saving Roe v. Wade in the 1990s. Colbert is founding director of Barnard's Athena Center for Leadership Studies. Welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Remind us of that case. It was Casey, as it's known, and it was in the 1990s.
Right. In 1992, the court considered the validity of Roe versus Wade. And at that time, going into the case, we were absolutely convinced that there were 5 votes to overrule Roe, to return complete power to the states to make abortion illegal. That didn't happen. In our case, Justice Kennedy switched his view at the last minute, and we actually won the case. The court gave states more power to restrict abortion, but preserve what we think of as the hallmark of Roe, which is abortion can remain legal until viability.
What was your argument? If you thought you were going to lose 5-4, did it take a creative argument to sway somebody?
Well, We actually argued the case as much in the court of public opinion as we did in the court. We asked the court one question: is Roe versus Wade still the law of the land? Because it was really important for Americans to understand what was at stake. And unfortunately, lawyering and legalese gets complicated. You can't explain to people in an easy way what happens when they change the standard of review and states have greater power. So you have to be much more open about the broader question. That's what we did in this case, and I actually think it made a huge difference because the court finally understood that if they took away legalized abortion, women would be harmed dramatically.
You're suggesting that the justices of the Supreme Court don't just rule on the basis of the law and the Constitution, that public opinion, politics really, matters to them?
Well, I don't think per se it matters to them, but I think that the Supreme Court in the big picture often reflects the mood of a country. And when you have 200,000 people marching on the streets of Washington, D.C., when you have editorial boards writing about the loss of a constitutional right, when you have Americans standing up and saying, we don't want this to happen, and being prepared to vote in that regard, then I do think that the court pays attention to what the dominant mood of the country is. And I think there's a number of constitutional scholars that agree with me on that, and I think that's what happened here.
People say that played into the same-sex marriage decision last year. Do you think so?
I do. I don't think it, certainly for some of the justices, clearly the justices on the right and those who believe in the textualism, as Justice Scalia did, that's less important. But frankly, the fact that so many states had already moved to legalize gay marriage, had already moved to supporting the position of the plaintiffs in that case, then I think the court recognized that they were at a cultural juncture and they needed to reflect that.
It's amazing. Is it amazing to you as it is to me that we're still seeing arguments at the Supreme Court over so many of the same cases that we were, or the same big issues that we were in 1992, abortion, affirmative action, immigration?
You know, Brian, it is, I've been saying this a lot this last week, which feels like 1992 all over again. The court this term has big issues before it. And that's why, in some ways, the death of Justice Scalia is so momentous. Not only does it shift the balance of power over the long term, or at least gives the potential for that to happen, but you also have a variety of really important cases that make a difference in the lives of many millions of Americans that are at issue. And I think the longer the political process goes in replacing Justice Scalia, the harder it is to justify doing so because so many people are affected.
So let's do one or two of those. This is really the year of the biggest abortion case since your Casey argument in 1992, right?
That's right. There's a case that's coming out of Texas. Challenges a number of what are called trap laws, or laws that place a lot of restrictions on legal abortion, particularly requiring onerous medical things for every clinic to do in order to be licensed. Also requires doctors to jump through lots of hoops before they can continue to perform abortions. But the bottom line is, if this particular law is upheld, I think it's Texas goes down from having somewhere around 25 abortion clinics to under 12, and as a result, women's access to the legalized abortion is narrowed considerably. The question before the court is whether my case remains the law. That is Planned Parenthood versus Casey still the correct standard? And if so, is this law unconstitutional under that?
And how about the affirmative action case?
Well, that
was around in the 90s too.
Exactly right. And you know, the case before the court this time asks a very similar question, which is, what is the role of race in determining college admissions? And should that be a factor when a college is making determinations about which students should be admitted and which shouldn't?
Will both of these be decided wrongly in your view because of the death of Scalia?
Well, let me just say the abortion case, first we have to see what happens when a court is tied. If Justice Kennedy stays with his initial opinion as he did in Casey, if he reaffirms his own opinion in Casey, then we would win 5-3. That is, Texas law would be unconstitutional. If for some reason Justice Kennedy switches his vote, then the vote becomes 4-4. And in that instance, the lower court decision is affirmed, meaning the Texas law would go into effect, but the opinion wouldn't have precedential value to other circuits. So it's less onerous in terms of the bigger picture. The other thing, in my view, is if that is likely to happen, if it ends up in a 4-4 tie, the historical record shows that in many of those instances, the divided court asks the case to be held over for re-argument until a new justice is appointed. And that gets us right back to the question of, when is a new justice going to be appointed? Because if you hold it over to the fall, great. But if you have to wait till the following spring, that would be unprecedented.
So how do you think the death of Scalia, if at all, affects the presidential race? They were already staking out positions. Hillary Clinton had already said that she had several litmus tests for any appointee of hers to the Supreme Court, including having the pro-abortion rights position on Roe and the pro-voting rights position on voting rights, and Citizens United, and Sanders had singled out Citizens United and overturning it as his single-issue litmus test. And, of course, the Republicans have staked out the other side to a man. So is there any impact on the presidential race that you see?
I think there's huge impact on the presidential race because the issues of what is the law of the land for the next 35, 40 years are determined by this particular appointment to the court. Because for the most part, there's old people on both sides of the issue, but if the liberal end of the court has 5 votes going forward, I think there's a sea change. That affects the presidential race in 2 ways. It brings out single-issue voters on both sides. The right wing has a lot of single-issue voters: anti-abortion, pro-guns, anti-affirmative action. All of those people will be rabid about the appointment to the court. And in similar fashion, if, frankly, the Democratic Party is lucky, there will be equal anger about or concern about the Supreme Court and a willingness to vote on those issues.
One scenario I could see potentially on the Democratic side is if Obama, as is being speculated, nominates a relatively moderate justice, trying to get that person through the Senate this year.
Right.
I wonder if Bernie Sanders will take a position that, no, there you go again, mainstream Democrats, being centrist. I'm going to appoint a real progressive to the Supreme Court, while Hillary maybe would support the person.
Although the irony of this, of course, is Bernie Sanders only has one litmus test, which is Citizens United. He doesn't care about any of those other issues. And he cares about them, but that's not determinative of who would be appointed. And in many ways, it is those other issues. It's affirmative action. It's how you treat race and race discrimination, how you treat abortion, how you treat gay marriage, that are the cultural issues that the Supreme Court is called upon to resolve.
So stay here as we bring in some additional evidence. Time for evidence-based politics, where we pour cold, hard facts on the overheated campaign rhetoric. Crime in America doesn't occupy the prominent place in presidential forums that it did back when Bill and Hillary backed a crime bill that still puts too many in prison. But at last week's Democratic debate in Wisconsin, the criminal justice system took criticism from both candidates. Bernie Sanders, in an uphill battle for minority votes, repeated what he often says on the campaign trail, decrying the record rates of incarceration in America, minorities earning harsher sentences, and, of course, police violence.
Clearly, when we talk about a criminal justice system, I would hope that we could all agree that we are sick and tired of seeing videos on television of unarmed people, often African Americans, shot by police officers. What we have got to do is make it clear that any police officer who breaks the law will, in fact, be held accountable.
No disagreement there from Clinton, who then elaborated on why so many young people get caught up in the justice system in the first place.
But I would also add this. There are other racial discrepancies, really systemic racism in this state as in others, in education, in employment, in the kinds of factors that too often lead from a position where young people, particularly young men, are pushed out of school early, are denied employment opportunities. So when we talk about criminal justice reform and ending the era of mass incarceration, we also have to talk about jobs, education, housing, and other ways of helping communities.
Sanders went on to echo similar language. Criminal justice this year comes in the context of historically low crime rates in much of the country. So how did we get here? And what does it mean for the presidential race? Here to tell us about that is Barry Latzer, Emeritus Professor at CUNY's John Jay College of Criminal Justice and author of a new book, The Rise and Fall of Violent Crime in America. He joins us via Skype from Miami. Hello from New York, Professor.
Hello, Brian. Good to be with you.
The arc of violent crime, viewers will see that the increase is steep starting at around 1960, and then it starts going down there in the early 90s. The second graph shows incarceration rates. They go up with the crime rate, but keep going up all the way through 2010, even as crime starts coming down. Why did those two graphs diverge?
Brian, crime began accelerating in the late 1960s. If we measure the increase in violent crime rates from 1960 to 1990, they go up 353%. So this created tremendous pressure to change criminal justice policies and increase both arrests and incarcerations. Of course, there's a lag between the pressures to make these changes and the actual changes. The increase in incarceration begins to start in the mid-70s. In the 80s, when actually violent crime began to sink in the early 80s, but maybe we could touch on that a bit later. In the 80s, incarceration rates went up 107%. So this is the steepest increase for any decade that we have. In the early 90s, crime begins to decline, and incarceration rates do keep increasing in the early 90s, but by the early 2000s, they flatten. So during the 2000s decade, crime rates only increase 0.65%, which in essence is simply flat. There's no real increase. And from 2000...
This brings us to how Hillary Clinton is paying a potential price today on the campaign trail for the imprisonment boom of the 90s. Reversing mass incarceration, of course, is a leading issue today. And opponents have been replaying this clip of her from the 1990s, supporting the crime bill using what now is considered inflammatory racial language.
Not just gangs of kids anymore. They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy. We can talk about why they ended up that way, but first we have to bring them to heel.
Bring them to heel, and super predators. And at least through today's lens, when we're talking about primarily or disproportionately African American kids, that's seen as inflammatory language. But you cite studies in your book indicating no proof that the Clinton crime bill, the centerpiece of which was to add 100,000 police officers nationwide, was ever correlated with reductions in crime. Do you believe the evidence suggests that police department buildups did not matter?
No, they mattered because they were part of a general buildup and hardening of the criminal justice system. So I think they contributed to the reduction in crime, and the studies do show that incarceration rate increases did correlate with reductions in crime.
So incarceration rates, which are now the issue, had something to do with reductions in crime? Your interpretation of the historical evidence would suggest because, what, potentially dangerous people were behind bars in larger numbers?
Yeah, incapacitation effect, and there was also a deterrent effect, although the studies really have a hard time differentiating between the two. We also have negative evidence in this. When crime accelerated in the late 60s, early 70s, the criminal justice system was weak and caved. In fact, police clearance rates went down, the commitments to prison went down, and the time served in prison went down. And so this encouraged more crime at a time when crime was already spiking and disturbing everybody in the country.
Professor Latzer, thank you very much for joining us with some historical perspective. In our remaining time, Professor Colbert, there's an issue that people are tending to dismiss, but Donald Trump keeps bringing it up, and that is the issue of Ted Cruz's eligibility to be president because he was born in Canada. What does the Constitution say about this?
Well, it says you have to be a natural-born citizen. So the question is whether or not the son or daughter of a American citizen born in a foreign country is natural-born. If the cases all
were... It's such a funny phrase, isn't it? It doesn't mean anything to us today, natural-born.
Well, it's because it was, in terms of the framing of the 14th Amendment and the way that it changed who was a citizen for purposes of voting and becoming legal citizenship. And that's why the term is there. But the real issue is all of the cases have shown that if you are born on a military base, for example, in Germany or in a foreign country, to an American mother or an American father, you are considered a natural-born citizen. In this instance, Cruz is born to a
U.S. citizen.
U.S. citizen living in Canada, but not on a military base. And so that question is that still a natural-born citizen?
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And that's POTUS 2016 for today. South Carolina Republicans and Nevada Democrats go to the polls this Saturday. CNN, by the way, will televise 2 South Carolina GOP town meetings with candidates, one tonight and one tomorrow. Also tomorrow, Thursday, the 18th, MSNBC will host a Democratic candidate forum. Don't overdose. We'll be back next week at the same hour, following the horse race and pouring cold, hard facts on the overheated campaign rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.